My work over the last 10 years or so has actually focused on thinking about how our social and economic lives, mostly our economic lives, are deeply coded in legally binding commitments that we make as individuals, we make as firms, or sovereign states make as well. And most of these commitments have a lot to do with debt. So we make commitments to rent a house, or we pay a mortgage for our homes. We lease a car, we have a credit line, we use credit cards, we are living largely on debt. And this works as long as we can make commitments into the future that most of us will most of the time live by. The problem of this pandemic, of course, is that not only is the future uncertain, we know this. Maynard Keynes and Frank Knight have said years and years ago, the future is fundamentally uncertain. But we now also live through a period where the present is radically different from the past. And of course, the future is uncertain. And yet most of us are still committed to things that we made, to commitments we made in the past under radically different circumstances. It's of course not the first time in history that this has happened, but I think the ramifications are pretty large because most of the world is experiencing this pandemic, and most of the world lives on a debt finance system, and we will have a very hard time, if not, it will be impossible for most of us to make good on the commitments that we've made in the past. But I'm basically trying to do two things at the same time. I'm just trying to take in what's happening around us, and that it could be a 24-hour job, but we're still teaching. We're teaching via Zoom and online, so I have to do that too. But at the same time, I'm trying to understand how we have dealt with similar situations in the past and what they might be telling us for how to deal with this now. I've written 2 op-eds on the topic, and I'm thinking about more. One I wrote for The Guardian about 4 weeks ago, where I basically said we need a real debt restructuring, we need debt forgiveness, debt relief. It's just not enough just to give people a little bit of a liquidity help here. This crisis is not a liquidity crisis. The 2008 crisis was mostly a liquidity crisis. Some financial intermediaries were really insolvent. Lehman Brothers arguably was insolvent. Others might have become insolvent, but the central banks around the world were able to stabilize the system by injecting the liquidity into the system. My hope is, I'm typically an optimistic person. I might have sounded a little bit gloomy, but I think my hope is that we learn from this crisis. And that goes back to what I said at the outset. We have to learn to live in a world that will become much more volatile, that already is so much more volatile than it has been in the past. And some of the volatility comes from our excessive reliance on debt. But some of the volatility, of course, also comes from climate change. And so we have to, and we've been talking about this for some time, we have to deal with the fact that the future will be highly volatile, not only uncertain. We know for certain it will be uncertain and volatile. But our systems are not made to deal with that. If you make binding legal commitments to do something in the future that you committed in the past, based on the assumption that the future always has to be a little bit better than the past, because otherwise how can we pay off the debt? We're taking debt because we can't afford our lives, right? So my hope is that we learn from this crisis and that we learn how to deal with an uncertain future, and we have to delever. We have to rely much less on debt. We have to think much more how to rely on what we have, and we have to think about this redistribution much more than just saying, well, let's just make sure that poor people also have access to credit, right? Poor people can't afford to lose what they have in times of crisis. They need insurance, they need much more support. They can't just rely on debt. They're the first ones to be forced to default on their loans or on their commitments that they made, but because they have no resilience. In the United States, there are so many households that don't even have $400 to deal with an emergency situation like that in the bank account. They have nothing. if you're in that situation, but you still have to rent your place, right? You have no room to maneuver. Lots of people, of course, are thinking about sort of new types of social programs, a right to housing, a right to shelter, and things like that have to be created. We have to think about how to reset our systems to be able to deal with that.